what do we mean by ethics in digital-ready lawmaking? Well, I think I would reframe the question, what should we mean by ethics in digital-ready lawmaking? And it seems to me that digital-ready has two different meanings that we need to be very clear of here. And I think in the introduction, it was hinted at what both of those meanings, and it can be confused quite easily. So the first for me is the notion of policy that results in traditional legislation that's, quote, fit for evolving IT landscapes, which to quote the EIF document, that's the kind of old school notion of digital ready. So traditional laws which are made for tech. And then the second notion, which I think is more relevant to the discussion today, is the idea of legislation that's developed using new digital tech. So better drafting workflows, applications and tools for actually writing the text of legislation, newer digital representations, for example, using the semantic web, other forms of structured documents that can improve search, archiving, can even allow things like checking documents, logical flows of rules. And I think at the more extreme end, the notion of integrating rules directly into the systems that are being regulated, and that's code as law, as was mentioned earlier. So there the idea of readiness is more about improving legislative processes and practices, and I think that's reflected in the notion of better rules, which is the umbrella term that's often used for this kind of work around the world, particularly in New Zealand at the moment. But for me, I think the crucial question we have to ask is, when we say better, when we talk about improving, like what actually constitutes an improvement? What makes something better? What are the assumptions that we're making about those improvements? And this is a question about the kind of society that we want to build, because the technologies that we use to make laws, they're not neutral, and neither is the medium that we use to embody laws. It's not neutral. And it's very easy to think that it is because we're so used to it, we work with it every day, but it's not neutral. It may be good, it may improve things, it may make things better, it may make things worse, but it's inevitable that it's going to make a change. So it's never neutral. And for me, the interesting question, or the crucial question, is whether those effects have a kind of reflexive effect on the nature of law. So when you introduce one of these new systems, does it do something to the nature of law, the concept of law that we want to uphold in the kinds of societies that we want to have? Now, depending on the kind of digital representation we're talking about and where and how it's applied, as Niovi said, interpretation is central to law, absolutely central to law. And some forms of computational representation undermine or constrict interpretation in ways that we might not be immediately aware of, and that might have these effects that come home to roost in the future. So they seem fine now, but they're not actually fine because they're creating changes, perturbations in the law, which we will only discover later on. Now, of course, case law gives texture, gives context to the rules which the Parliament produces, which the legislature produces, and that's part of the kind of more procedural aspect of law. So I would take a slight issue with what Niovi, how Niovi characterized law as a system of rules. That's one aspect of it, but it's also a system of processes, a system of interpretation, and a system of adjudication. And if you just talk about it in terms of rules, it seems very easy to think, well, we should digitize the rules. That's obvious. But that would collapse all of these other aspects, which is dangerous in my mind. So we need that kind of flexibility. We need to retain that flexibility in a democracy if we're going to retain democracy as we know it. So that coming back to the main question, the idea of it being ethical, why am I talking about this in terms of ethics? Well, in a sense, this issue comes before law. It speaks to how we do law. It speaks to the conditions in which we can do law. And if you think of, take the S off the end of ethics and think about the ethic, like the ethos. What's the position that we're taking? What's the kind of normative stance that we have toward law as an enterprise, as an ordering mechanism for society? That ethic has to be retained, and it's built on, as I say, interpretation, due process, etc. And without those, you kind of remove the building blocks of the ethic, which makes
Laurence?
it possible. Yeah.
So we are very short in the timing. So whenever you see me, you need to wrap up. I think
okay,
because
right.
you can let this area.
Okay, let me just say one more sentence.
Okay.
Two more sentences then. I think we need to retain a commitment to a certain type of law, but we can't be blind to the technologies that make that kind of law possible. So when we introduce new technologies like digital forms of lawmaking and digital representations of law, we have to be extremely aware of how those new technologies, those new representations might change the nature of law. And I'm not talking about the substance, the particular rules, I'm talking about the nature of the system, which make those rules possible, which make law possible. And I don't have the answer to the question, but that's the kind of awareness I'd like everyone to have.
Very nice framing. Thank you, Laurence. And now, Lefteris, your approach.
Hello, all. Good morning from Greece. Many thanks to European Commission, to Cecile, Niovi, Sofia, and Tisa for your kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here today. I think that the this introduction made my job a lot easier because you provided a brief but precise enough assessment on the distinction between law and ethics. So as a starting point, it's important to underline that we do not mean what we do not mean by ethics. So there is interference with human rights framework, such as the right to privacy, right to data protection, the right to access to justice, and other human rights and freedoms. Having said that, what do we actually mean by ethics? I'm sure that all of us have different ideas in our minds. And by the way, it will be lovely to hear from the members of the audience in the comment section what they think. For me, I guess the first things that come into my mind is a question around legitimacy. In a digital lawmaking context, legislators create laws in a machine-readable format, which allows legal provisions to be understood and interpreted by computer systems in a consistent way. This is more or less the idea, but can actually legislators interpret the law, or at least mandate a group of experts to create such a software to interpret the law for themselves? Do they have actually the authority to do that? The answer for me is clear, and it is no. They do not have the authority to do that because in a real democracy, we have separation of powers. So the legislators make laws, the executive power enforce laws, the courts interpret laws. If the legislators make, enforce, and interpret laws altogether, then we have a breach of this three-dimensional balance, which is crucial for safeguarding our democracies, which is crucial for preventing concentration of power. And I guess that a second thing that comes into my mind is a discussion around justice and fairness and the connection between the two in the digital lawmaking. So fairness often has been used to refer to the ability to make judgments that are not overly general, but they are concrete and they are specific to a particular case. However, in the digital lawmaking concept, the legal provisions are to be understood and auctioned by computer system in a consistent way. It's like a factory of judicial decisions. But the judicial interpretation of laws is something much more than just reading the plain text. And I believe also that it's important to reflect on the philosophy of judicial activism, holding that the courts can and should go beyond the applicable law. My point is that we need to recognize the limits of judicial textualism.